From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Yes, we're here. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. This week's comments on the cattle markets from Lee Schulz of Iowa State University. As the cattle trades have taken a hit, of course, from the coronavirus situation, Lee will look at current trends in the futures market that lend to more optimism for cattle feeders moving forward. Also today, K-State's Keith Harmoney will continue with his series on grazing management rules of thumb and whether they earn a thumbs up or a thumbs down as guidelines to follow in planning out this year's pasture management. And later, Jeff Wickman with this week's 4-H segment. K-State's Beth Hinshaw talks about preparing for the State 4-H Horticulture Judging Contest, set for late summer. All that and more next on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Thanks for tuning in. This is Agriculture Today. And right off the bat, our cattle market segment for this week. Joining us via phone from his office in Ames, Iowa, is livestock economist Lee Schulz of Iowa State University. Lee, of course, it's all about this pall of uncertainty over the markets because of the coronavirus situation. The cattle trades are feeling the burden as well.
Certainly. It's almost impossible, really, to digest how much and how fast these markets have dropped, really, in a very short period of time. I guess we will try to do that here and maybe get some signals for where the markets were going. You know, looking at the cash market, we've seen this last week traded about $3 lower, 110 live. Maybe a bit later in the week, it was 105 to 108. That's a far disconnect from where futures prices are, and we're actually seeing very strong basis levels. If you look at the April contract compared to those cash prices, that suggests a $15 basis. Now, what that may signal is that the futures markets have overshot the market, and that's a real obvious, I think, when we look at just the change in those prices over the last couple of weeks.
Again, it's hard to hang one's hat on what's going to happen from here, but we look at what little we can rely upon, such as the latest beef trade data. What is that telling us, Lee?
Well, that may be one of the positives when we kind of look at this market. And I look at two different pieces of trade data. There's the official monthly data, and that was released recently, but that's only for January. And when we look at beef exports, when we compare January 2020 to January 2019, we've seen an increase of 2.5% in volume. Value was up 5%. That's muscle cuts and variety meats together. Now, even though that was just a modest increase, these were the highest ever muscle cut exports for the month of January. And so we're seeing rather strong beef exports still, but again, that was still just for January, where the situation with COVID-19 has obviously changed since January. Now, when you look at, overall, though, we've seen countries be able to respond to this, and consumption and demand has remained relatively strong. And I think that bears out in the weekly trade data. And so this is the data from USDA Foreign Ag Service, and it's for fresh, chilled, and frozen muscle cuts of beef. And when we look at that data, accumulated exports through March 5th are up 34% compared to a year ago. If we add the outstanding sales, so this is a product that's been booked but not necessarily shipped yet, that's up 3%. So collectively, those total commitments for all destinations are up 17% for the beef market. And you have to go all the way through the major countries down to Hong Kong before you see a year-over-year decline, with Japan being up 42%, South Korea up 4%, Mexico 10%, Canada 14% up, even China up 20%. So overall, the trade picture is rather positive in this market.
That is as of March the 5th. Now, COVID-19 may have something to say about that in the weeks ahead.
And that's certainly the case. Early on, it was mostly focused on China, but now it's become a world pandemic, and know that we're subject to movement restrictions, lockdowns, closure of food service markets potentially. And so all of that has the impact to potentially impact trade. And I think domestic consumption is also very much important, and we're going to need to monitor that. We've so far seen retailers are finding really unprecedented traffic in supermarkets across the country. Now, not just buying meat products, buying really all products that they think they're going to need. But the real question is, are those meals at home now, which is going to be predominantly the case, is it going to be beef, or is it going to be pork, or is it going to be poultry, or what combination is that going to be? And realizing we're having record production here in 2020. So it's going to be important to increase consumption domestically, move that meat overseas. And that's really a tough pill to swallow, really, given the current situation.
But we might throw in here, Lee, one positive note amidst all of this gloom and doom of recent days, that China did announce late last week that it would now be accepting beef from cattle to which hormones had been administered. That would clear another obstacle for more U.S. beef moving into that market.
Anytime there's potential for more market access, yes, that is a positive sentiment in the market. Now, given what the market's all dealing with otherwise, that I think really falls down the list of major market movers, at least in the short run. Yeah. Now, China, as I mentioned, is up for the year considerably. But that's somewhat of an artifact of just how low exports of beef were last year. And so China is a relatively small market for us. About 1% of our production is exported to China. Now, that has the potential to grow much longer term, but shorter term, I don't expect it to give much relief in the form of increased exports to China.
Point of focus that you wanted to bring to our attention this week, Lee, the extreme deterioration in cattle feeding returns. You think that those could rebound at some point in the relative near future. You might expand on that.
Well, it's probably not a surprise, given the decline in prices we've seen for fed cattle, that margins for feedlots have deteriorated. And just to give some numbers behind that, and I'm using the Iowa State Estimated Livestock Return Series, for the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, I was forecasting a rather good profit for cattle feedlots, roughly about $40 per head for all of 2020. Now, by February, that deteriorated to about break even. And now, as I run my numbers as of last Friday, March 13th, that shows a $132 loss for all of 2020. So that's about $170 decline in profitability for 2020. Now, if what we suggested is the markets have likely overreacted, and we will see some rebound in those prices. But also, I think you need to look at the potential for purchasing feeders in this market, because along with fed cattle, feeder cattle have slid significantly as well. So this provides, if we see that rebound in 2020, provides potential large profits for cattle feeders who make feeder cattle purchases at these relatively low prices. Now, that is a risk because, we have a lot of uncertainty in this market, but the fundamentals prior to the real impact of COVID-19 showed rather profitable prices here in 2020. And so I think if we get any rebound back to there, these feeder cattle prices will look like a rather good deal from a cattle feeder standpoint.
Well, every once in a while, difficulties do beget opportunities, so cattle feeders can look at it in that light. But we want to finish on some information, once again, tied to COVID-19. You put out an article last week, as a matter of fact, on how the cattle markets have been shaken by the coronavirus issue. And you want producers and others who would be interested in the topic to consider the price curve, what's happening with the futures trades.
Yeah, so as market analysts, we're all trying to understand this situation and give suggestions to producers that follow our information. That's becoming very, very difficult because things are changing by really the second. And so I think when you're looking at markets like this and such uncertainty and such rapid reaction, it's important to also dig down into the fundamentals of the market, because if we do suspect a rebound, those fundamentals are what's going to drive that rebound in this marketplace. But what I found interesting, looking at what's changed here, is two terms that we typically use is backwardation and contango. And so backwardation tells you that far out futures prices are at a discount relative to, say, the near-term contract. So February earlier on this year, and now looking at the April contract, and then comparing like a year out into the February 2021 or April 2021, those prices would be lower. Now, that's what the pattern had been until we really got here into February, where it got into a pattern of contango, where now the near-term prices are much lower than the far-out prices. And so what that suggests is you could be potentially bullish in this market, as if the current situation is resolved, the fundamentals are suggesting higher prices as we get a year out. So I think, there's not much to do currently in these markets from a risk management standpoint, understanding that we're expecting a rebound here. Any risk management that had been done earlier has certainly protected against these lower prices. But in a current environment like this with high uncertainty, high option values, the cost of doing risk management is very expensive. And so, it's a bit of a wait and see here. Yeah. But some of the fundamentals are out there are suggesting that prices could be much higher once we work through this situation.
Well, at this juncture, we'll take any sliver of good news amidst all of this. So, Lee, thanks for the input. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
That's livestock economist Lee Schulz, Iowa State University, contributing those thoughts on the cattle market trends here on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Welcome back. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. You might recall several weeks back, our guest now joined us to launch a series for you grassland managers out there on the grazing management rules of thumb, as he's put it. Keith Harmoney is with us from his office in Hays, where he's the rangeland scientist at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hays. What you've done here, Keith, is pulled together some things we often hear discussed when the topic of grazing management comes up. These might earn a thumbs up or a thumbs down from your perspective, right?
Yeah, there are little phrases or rules of thumb that managers use to help try to manage their grass more effectively. And basically, I have taken these rules of thumb and either given them a thumbs up if I agree with the rule of thumb, or a thumbs down if I disagreed with it. And if it was one that could be argued either way, I would give it a thumbs up and a thumbs down.
All right. You shared with us rules of thumb 1 through 4 last time we visited, so today we'll tackle rules 5 through 8. And number 5 on that list, don't be overgrazed and understocked. What do you say to that?
Well, I gave that rule of thumb a thumbs up, because basically that rule of thumb is addressing livestock distribution throughout the pasture. We've all seen pastures where there's areas that get heavy utilization, and in that same pasture, there's areas that don't look like they receive much grazing pressure at all. And there's a few reasons why that occurs. Some of the most important ones are that animals tend to stay closer to livestock watering areas. Now, water is the most essential nutrient that animals have, and so they're not going to travel more than a mile to water on flat terrain, and even less when the terrain is hilly. And so in pastures that are large or odd-shaped, you may get areas of that pasture where animals just won't travel to. They're going to stay closer to water. Also, there's a tendency for animals to create grazing lawns. Under continuous season-long stocking, animals may go back and graze parts of a pasture over and over again and create this grazing lawn where other areas may not get as much use. And so you get these areas that are heavily utilized and in the same pasture areas that are underutilized. So a few things that you can do to help remedy that situation are you can develop watering areas in parts of a pasture that get less use. You can split pastures and fence them differently so animals will be forced to stay in certain parts of a pasture that tend to get underutilized. Or you could do a prescribed burn on areas of a pasture that are underutilized. Those three things are basically the most surefire ways to get animals to utilize a part of a pasture more than they do already by one of those three management tools.
Point is that one can manage toward that pasture uniformity, and so that gets a thumbs up. What you see above ground is what you get below ground, another rule of thumb. Any validity to that, Keith?
Yeah, that's definitely a thumbs up. What you see above ground is basically the same thing that you get below ground. If you have a pasture that has abundant above-ground vegetation, you're also going to have a pasture with plants that have an abundant root system. Grass plants have a first priority for putting out leaf growth. And so once that plant photosynthesizes and uses its carbohydrates to produce leaf growth, then as it continues to produce carbohydrates, it's going to use those carbohydrates as building blocks to put into root growth. And so plants that have a lot of leaf material are also going to have abundant root material in the soil. And because of that, those roots are going to be able to grow deeper. They're going to explore more soil volume. And so those plants are also going to be able to absorb nutrients and water from a greater volume of soil. Pastures that are heavily utilized, or areas of a pasture that are heavily utilized and don't have much above-ground growth, also are going to have more shallow root systems. And so they're going to be exploring less soil volume for water and nutrients. And so you're going to get less production out of those parts of a pasture. So essentially, a producer that has a pasture that's heavily utilized, that's exploring less soil volume and also capturing less water that falls because of runoff from less residue on the soil surface, they can actually create their own drought situation even in periods of average precipitation.
That water infiltration is a major factor here.
Yes, it is. A study done out here at Hayes back in the 50s and 60s showed that a pasture with light utilization has twice the infiltration rate as a pasture with heavy utilization.
So, again, encouragement to pay attention to that balance between what's above ground, what's below the soil surface as you manage that grass.
That's right. The plant actually has more below-ground tissue and roots than what it does in above-ground leaf material. So more than half the weight of the total plant is actually below the soil surface.
The next on your list of rules of thumb, it goes like this: 60% of pasture growth occurs by July the 1st. True or false?
Well, I give that a thumbs up as well. Our native rangelands in Kansas are dominated by warm season perennial grasses. And once pastures start to green up in the spring, it's because the soil temperatures have reached above that 55-degree temperature that breaks dormancy. Once soil temperatures then reach 65 degrees, they're undergoing really rapid growth. And so the months of May and June, as those temperatures are warming, those plants are putting out a lot of growth. By the end of May, about 30% of growth has occurred, and by the end of June, 60% of growth has occurred.
And that is true no matter where you are really in the state as far as your native warm season pastures go.
Yeah, that's going to be true from the short grass region all the way to the tall grass region in the east. And if there's any cool season grasses as major components in a pasture, even more than 60% will have been produced by July 1st because the cool season grasses are going to start growing earlier in the year than the warm season grasses.
Well, the last rule of thumb we'll touch upon today, Keith, and there will be more to come in a subsequent visit. This one reads as follows: wet winters produce more grass. And you hear folks say that from time to time. Does that hold any water, so to say?
Well, I give that rule of thumb a thumbs down. We have decades of weather data and pasture production data out here at Hayes, and in analyzing those two together, it basically shows that winter precipitation has very little effect on end-of-year pasture production. I do hear folks say that they hope we have a wet winter so they have a lot of grass during the next year, but it's not that winter precip that has the largest impact on end-of-year production. The time of year when we need precipitation that has the greatest effect on pasture production is actually May and June precipitation. And that makes perfect sense because the time periods of the year where most growth occurs is during May and June. So that's when those plants need precipitation. In fact, in doing an analysis here with our Hayes data, we have a direct linear relationship of forage production and precipitation that's received in May and June, if it's below average precipitation. So if we have a May and June that's below average rainfall, we can predict how much forage we will be lacking at the end of the year. And that's important for being able to manage for drought situations where you can look at the amount of rainfall that you receive and basically know whether or not you need to plan on destocking certain pastures before the end of the year because you're going to be having less forage.
Conversely, if it's a rainy stretch, May to June, one can maybe think about leaving cattle out a bit longer if they're so inclined. That's
a possibility. The relationship is not as strong with above-average precipitation from our data that we have here at Hayes. The precipitation that we receive that's above average does not directly equate into the same amount of forage production at the end of the year. And I think that's probably because as we increase rainfall, that means we're also more than likely getting more runoff of the pasture. And so we're losing that moisture, so it's not going directly into forage production. But back to the original point, staking what's going to happen on the moisture over the winter really has no value to the producer as they think about stocking rates going forward here. No, not nearly as important as the amount of precip that we receive in May and June. And Keith, you've more of these you put together that you'll be sharing as you did with these in another Beef Tips newsletter out of the K-State Animal Sciences and Industry Department. By the way, producers can check these out and the previous set of rules and whether they get a thumbs up or thumbs down at ksubeef.org. Good information as we start lining things out for another stocking season ahead. Keith, we appreciate the input. Many thanks. All right. Thank you for having me on with you. You bet. He's Keith Harmoney, rangeland scientist at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State research and extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and moving ahead now with today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. And more on something we alluded to in our cattle market segment with Lee Schulz earlier in the broadcast. China has drawn up food safety standards on residue limits of growth hormones in beef. That's a move seen as a further step toward opening up its market to U.S. beef. China had previously shown zero tolerance for any residues of growth hormone. China, in the Phase 1 agreement with the U.S. signed in January, agreed to set residue limits for 3 hormones used in beef, besides other changes to make more U.S. beef eligible for export to China. China last month conditionally lifted a ban on beef and beef products from U.S. animals more than 30 months old, another condition agreed to under the Phase 1 trade deal. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue told Senate Appropriations Agriculture Subcommittee members that he does not think that farmers should count on more market facilitation program payments. But he said if trade does not materialize, quoting him, "We are prepared to look at that again." The likely need for a third round of trade aid was emphasized by Republican lawmakers. Panel Chairman John Hoeven of North Dakota was asking if MFP3 were to be offered, if the USDA had the resources to do that based on where they were in terms of the CCC program, Commodity Credit Corporation monies. Perdue responded, quoting him, "We would like to really know the timing there and really look at our cash flow within CCC." He noted that Congress did replenish CCC last year to ensure MFP2 payments were able to be dispersed on time. Quoting him, "What we know right now is the MFP program was a trade disruption program and not a price support mechanism." Perdue there echoing his comments made before. Brazilian beef imports are once again allowed into the U.S., but not without heightened inspections. More on that from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Ag Secretary Sonny Perdue said top food safety and inspection service officials went to Brazil to inspect beef facilities.
We audited several of those. As you know, we operate on an equivalency. We suspended their ability to import into the United States for over 2 years.
The United States had halted imports of Brazilian beef in June 2017 because of concerns over food safety violations. The secretary says although Brazilian beef is allowed back into this country, there will be a period of heightened vigilance.
We still have stepped-up inspections here over beef coming in there, and we'll continue that until they have earned the right to be totally back on a normal inspection cycle.
Brazil is one of the world's top beef exporters. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
One report has it that Bayer AG has agreed on draft settlement terms with half a dozen law firms representing tens of thousands of plaintiffs, alleging that its Roundup herbicide causes cancer, pushing the litigation closer to a final resolution. That's according to people familiar with the matter. The 6 large firms speak on behalf of dozens of other firms that represent the large chunk of the plaintiffs suing Bayer. Bayer is striving to find a way to both keep Roundup on consumer shelves and end the litigation that significantly damaged its share price following the loss of 3 jury trials. For weeks, Bayer and plaintiffs' attorneys have been discussing a settlement in the $10 billion range. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, citing people familiar with the matter. One person said the deal still appears poised to end up around that number, but they cautioned that a formal deal has not been signed and could yet fall apart. Parties on both sides are free to walk away from the agreements, and Bayer has said that protecting itself from future litigation is a condition of any settlement. Now, the parties could reach a final agreement in the coming weeks, and that would help Bayer appease anxious shareholders in advance of its annual meeting in late April. Tens of thousands of plaintiffs have sued Bayer, saying that glyphosate is linked to cancer. The company has defended the product, noting that multiple regulators, including the Environmental Protection Agency, have said it to be safe. The company lost its first 3 jury trials, all of which it is appealing. And closer to home, Dan Mosier has been selected as the Associate Dean for Academic Programs here at K-State's College of Agriculture. Dan's first day in that post will be on April the 6th. Since 2014, he has served as the president of Angus Genetics Incorporated and the director of performance programs for the American Angus Association. There, he oversaw a 300% increase in genomic testing while leading education efforts for the 20,000-member organization. Prior to that, Dan was a faculty member in K-State's Animal Sciences and Industry Department from 1999 up to 2014, holding a similar position at the University of Nebraska from 1997 to 1999. Dan, a graduate assistant at the University of Georgia prior to that. Don Boggs, who has served as the Associate Dean for Academic Programs since 2005, will be entering phased retirement. And Dan Mosier has his bachelor's degree in animal sciences from K-State, as well as doctoral and master's degrees from the University of Georgia. So again, congratulations to Dan Mosier, the new Associate Dean for Academic Programs at K-State's College of Agriculture. Now, this week's edition of Tree Tales with K-State forester Charlie Barden. Charlie?
Adding a new tree to your yard should be a well-thought-out decision, since it should become an almost permanent part of the landscape, and will certainly last longer than a new car. In fact, the sturdy bur oak will likely outlast the house itself. Oftentimes, however, trees are planted without considering how large they will get in maturity, or if they will interfere with overhead or underground utilities. When these things happen, the tree becomes an expensive liability rather than a valuable asset in the landscape. Planting the right tree in the right place can help avoid these problems. When deciding what kind of tree to plant, you should consider how much room the site has. Do you really want the tree towering over the front of your house, or do you want something that just reaches the roof line? There are several new disease-resistant flowering crabapples that do not get so large as to overpower a single-story home, and some of them do not even produce fruit. Redbuds and Amer maples are two other choices for hardy, smaller trees that do not get too big. I was recently advising a city utility crew on their tree pruning work, and we visited several problem trees. 2 trees were growing up into the power lines, and their roots were wrapped around gas meters at their base. Homeowners were upset about the harsh pruning that needed to be done, but I reminded them that if a gas leak occurs, the crew would not be just using a chainsaw to trim the tree, they would be using a backhoe to rip it out. So if you're planting a tree this spring, look up before digging down. Make sure that the mature tree will not be crowding an overhead or underground utility line or blocking your favorite view from a window. By putting the right tree in the right place, it can add value and beauty to your landscape for many years to come. You've been listening to Tree Tales. I'm Charles Barden, Forest for K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Charlie. And you're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. Well, it's only mid-March, but we all know that April showers bring May flowers. And with that in mind, Southeast Area Kansas 4-H specialist Beth Hinshaw says it's a good time for youth in plant sciences to begin preparing for the state 4-H Horticulture Judging Contest set for August 15th on the Kansas State University campus. Beth, spring is just around the corner, and with that we start seeing the emergence of flowers and plants and all sorts of growing things. So this is really a good time to start thinking about horticulture judging, because this is something that you can't just show up for and take the exam.
Exactly. You know, I actually spent time in my own garden last weekend when it felt kind of springy, and it just made me think about gardening is one of those things that might be a spark for a young person. And so this is the time of year to start building that and supporting that. As we plant gardens, you know, there's going to be decisions about plants that we plant or seeds that we plant. That's a good time to start learning some of that identification. The other thing is, you know, kids may go lots of different directions with gardening. Certainly, I hope that horticulture judging might be something that they are interested in. But we also know that gardening might spark an interest with a young person with foods and what they do to prepare that afterward. It also might spark an interest with a young person with science. One of the things I did with my nephew last summer is we looked at how much a zucchini squash grew every time we came back out to the garden. So, there's all kinds of different things that might happen when you get your young people involved in gardening.
Yeah, there's the soil mixture, there's the water content, all sunshine, all sorts of things that come into play here.
Exactly. So when we think about our state horticulture judging contest, there are actually 3 parts to that. So one is identification. So at the contest, they'll have 50 things to identify. And those might be flowers and foliages, fruits and nuts, ornamentals, or vegetables and herbs. And a number of those things, the seed is something that you identify as well. And so then when you talk about, all the different knowledge that people might learn, there's a knowledge component to it as well. In the past, we've had publications that the young people have read, and they have an exam. Right now, our horticulture agents had a really great idea, and that was to use some of the horticulture videos. And so there's a number of videos that they need to watch and study, and that is our exam material this year. And then the third part of the State Horticulture Judging Contest is a judging piece, and that's where you have 4 items. So it's just like any other judging that we think about, judging contests. So we might have 4 plates of apples or 4 snapdragon plants in a pot, and we are making the determination of what is the best one, what's the second best one, what's the third best, and what's the worst one.
And this is both team and individual judging?
Definitely. So, certainly we know kids learn well when they can study with a team, but any young person who has that spark about being involved in horticulture can be a part of it. So most definitely we have teams and we have individuals.
And then you have a couple of different divisions as well.
Yes. What we do is we divide it by age. For the state contest, anybody who is 9 to 18 can take part in that. And then we break it on intermediates and seniors.
Now, is there a difference between, I'm assuming, what the intermediates need to know and understand and what the seniors need to know and understand?
There is not at the state contest. What we see a lot at contests at maybe county fairs or contests that are held by local extension units is maybe they will say, juniors, you're going to do the first 25 instead of all 50. But typically, intermediates and seniors have been the same. There's another thing that a number of our units do, and that's where they just have kind of a practice where maybe they put 10 things out on a table for kids who've never been involved before to see what they can identify.
Are there some tricks to this? Because I'm thinking this is really difficult because when you go to any nursery or gardening center, you can easily get confused and things kind of start looking the same to me.
Yeah, and you really, there is a lot of studying that goes into it. We've got a number of teams who make flashcards. The other great thing about spring and summer is all of these different parks, that we have in our communities. And there are several communities that I travel in for work that they even do a really nice job of labeling the different plants. And so, there's a lot of good field trip opportunities to go out and learn as well.
And as you mentioned, there's a lot of material available through 4-H and online.
Definitely. We even have a website where you can actually go and look at seeds or look at the plants. Now, I don't ever think that is a substitute for the real thing if you can do it, but, it's certainly another way to learn.
And they will be looking at the real plant when they do the judging?
Yes. When you walk into that room at the state contest, there are 2 sets of tables, and they each have 50 plates on them, and the real plant specimen is there. So it's the real seed, or it's the real Dieffenbachia plant, or it's the real peperomia plant, or it's the real bean seed, whatever. When we do the state contest, we actually have 2 sets of specimens. They're the same, but at the end of the contest, youth have the opportunity to go look at maybe a plant that's stumping them over on the other table to just see if maybe there's something that looks a tiny bit different that will give them a clue.
And will they get feedback through this as well?
Yes, often our coaches walk around with them at the end and go through all the plants and then also go through the judging classes, and they get all their paperwork back when the contest is complete as well.
As you mentioned, this is something that does take time, does take study time, and now is a good time to get started.
Yes, with spring, we're seeing all these plants in the garden centers, and we're seeing things come back in our yards and come back in our parks, and, we'll be planting all these seeds in our gardens, so it's the perfect time to start learning.
And I think for those who take part in the Horticulture Judging Contest, they'll also have a chance then to maybe qualify for the National Junior Horticulture Contest?
Yes, our winning state senior team has that opportunity to go to the national contest.
That's Southeast Area 4-H Specialist Beth Hinshaw. For more information about horticulture judging, visit kansas4h.org. Under the Projects tab, click on Agriculture and Natural Resources, then Plant Sciences. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.